Dear students, today we are going to discuss a very important lesson from the class 10th history textbook, and the title of the lesson is The Making of a Global World. We are all familiar with the word globalization, but what does it mean? Simply put, it talks about the process by which the world has become a more interconnected place. The visible signs of such global interconnectedness are often seen in the economic domain. Therefore, when we talk of globalization, we often refer to the economic system that has knit the world together in a dramatic way during the last 50 years or so. This has happened, and in fact, it is still happening in many ways in our life, and hence we are so familiar with it. But this process is not entirely a making of the last 50 years. Rather, it has a long history. The signs of human societies becoming steadily interlinked can be seen all through our civilizational history. If we look into our own past, we feel thrilled to find how an active coastal trade linked the Indus Valley civilization in South Asia with its contemporary Mesopotamian civilization in West Asia as early as 3000 before the Common Era. Furthermore, we also know how for more than a millennia, seashells, or what we call cowries in our country, from the Maldives went to China and East Africa to be used as a form of currency. Cowries, you might be knowing, were also widely used in India as currency for a very, very long time. Then there were the Silk routes, which, passing through land and by sea, not only linked vast regions of Asia, but also connected Asia with North Africa and Europe from before the beginning of the Common Era. And it continued till about the 15th century. If you look at a map of the world, then you can easily understand how these trade routes linked Asia with North Africa as well as other parts of the then known world. Though these pre-modern trade routes have come to be referred to as Silk routes because of the incidence of Chinese silk going to the west along these routes for a very long time, yet these were not the only articles to be traded through these routes. You will feel happy to know that textiles and spices from India as well as from the Southeast Asian region also went to the west, that means Europe, through these routes, and in return precious metals such as gold and silver came from there to Asia. One of the sites where we have discovered plenty of gold coins from the Roman Empire is in the southern part of India. But exchanges of goods were not the only means of such interconnections. Often trade and culture went hand in hand. However, when we talk about culture, we talk about several things. One such thing was religion. We all know how Buddhism, which originated in India, spread in many directions through mainly the intersecting points on the Silk routes much before the beginning of the Common Era. Here I may also like to point out what is being now referred to as the Common Era used to be earlier referred to as the Christian era. It started from the year when Jesus Christ was believed to have been born. It is one of the reasons why Gautam Buddha came to be called the light of Asia. We also know how subsequently early Christian missionaries and early Muslim preachers used these routes to spread their respective messages across continents. Thus, in this way, religious ideas going from Asia to other parts of the known world at the time, and mostly within Asia itself, brought people together, and they came to understand each other's views of life. The other thing was food. Food, as you all know, is the very basis of life and livelihood. It offers many examples of long distance cultural exchange. Take, for example, food items like potatoes, tomatoes, chilies, soybeans, groundnuts, maize, etc. These food items have become very popular and common to our life today. But these were not known to our ancestors till these were introduced to Europe and Asia in the 16th century, after the accidental discovery of the Americas by Christopher Columbus. Many times, these new crops made a huge difference between life and death of people, as their introduction enabled a large section, especially of the poorer population in Europe, to eat better and live longer. Its seriousness we can all understand from one fact, and that fact is about the death of hundreds of thousands of people who died out of starvation in Ireland during the mid 1840s. It happened primarily because the potato crop there perished because of a disease, and people who depended on potato crop could not find alternative sources of food for their sustenance. Besides these common food items, we can also talk about some ready-made foods. As you know, different societies had ready-made food in order to sustain themselves in difficult times. It was not always possible for people to cook food for their needs. Therefore, different societies had invented different ways of preserving food for use in times of need. One such food that we are very familiar today is noodles. As companies compete with each other in order to have noodles for popular consumption, then we sometimes wonder, where did this particular ready-made food originate? Many times it is suggested that along the Silk Route, noodles also went from China to West Asia, and from there, with a slightly different version that we call pasta, went to a place called Sicily, that is today in Italy, and thus it became very familiar all over Europe. But as I have already pointed out, such ready-made foodstuff were not unique to one society or one culture. They were there in different societies and cultures, and hence it is not easy today to clearly say which particular ready-made food item originated in which particular place. But this indicates how societies and cultures came in connection with each other through this important aspect of life and livelihood. The 16th century also became quite significant because a sea route to Asia was discovered during this time, and this happened from Europe. As you all may be knowing, earlier much of the trade from Asia with Europe happened over the land routes, but then it involved a number of intermediaries, particularly the Arab traders. And when things came to a head during some time when the Muslim power was in an ascendant position, the articles which were traded through them became very pricey or costly. And hence there was this need for the European countries to discover a direct link with the source of these goods, which was mostly in the East, that is India and the East Indies. And hence there was a competition among people to find these direct links. And we know how this sea route was discovered by the Portuguese and subsequently other European countries like France, England, the Netherlands. They all vied with each other in order to use the same route to trade with India and the East Indies. This is a very significant discovery, and on account of this discovery, European countries entered into the Indian Ocean trade system that had been in existence for a very long time, connecting people and ideas in the region with the Indian subcontinent as its center far more significantly. As you all know, India not only had a thriving coastal trade between the west coast and the east coast, going through the peninsular part of India. And many of these centers were thriving trade centers. Merchants with their goods and also cultural people went from these ports to either North Africa or to West Asia or even to the East Indies. Particularly, you may be familiar with the countries today there in Southeast Asia like Indonesia, Malaysia, and so on and so forth, to trade. And also they had trading outposts there. Sometimes even many such efforts were credited with the setting up of empires in these areas. So you can easily imagine that the Indian Ocean region was a thriving hub of international trade at that time. So now the entry of the Europeans into this trade system brought about significant change in the direction of the flows of the trade. It is not only that they could now trade with the East directly, but also because of their explorations and settlements in the Americas, they could finance their trade in Asia with precious metals such as silver, which they mined in places like Peru and Mexico. Please look at a map of the Americas. It consists of three geographical parts, if we may say so. One was the Northern America, where the United States of America and Canada are situated. We have also the Southern America, and part of it, after being colonized by the Portuguese and the Dutch, came to be known as the Latin Americas, and there was the Mesoamerica, the middle part of it. Besides, there were the Caribbean islands, small islands which also hosted a lot of colonists, where plantations workers were taken from other parts of the known world at that time, and huge plantations were created in order to supply articles of necessity back into Europe. So thus, you can well understand how the coming of the Europeans through the direct sea route that came to be discovered from Europe to the east, and with the discovery of America on the other side, brought Europe, Asia, Africa and the Americas much closer to each other through a complex web of interconnections. And in this, trade commingled with conquests and colonization. Conquests and colonization also led to much human misery, even though it hastened the process of stitching human destiny together in an unprecedented way. That means such kind of integration of the world economy had not been seen in earlier times. We have now talked about how the known world at the time, starting with the ancient civilizations like that of the Indus Valley civilization, the Mesopotamian civilization, the Egyptian civilization, the Greeks and the Chinese, they had some kind of correspondence with each other. Goods, pilgrims, ideas, they all flowed in each other's directions from these civilizational areas. Now bringing in some kind of an interconnection at that time among civilizations. But that had not seen the kind of economic integration which happened during this period. The instance of the Americas was especially horrendous, as earlier it was not in contact with the rest of the known world. At least we do not know if anyone before this discovery of the routes to the Americas by European explorers happened ever knew about the existence of such a vast land with so much of resources. Now as explorations happened, the vast land mass came to be known to the rest of the world, we discovered that they had also very developed cultures. But somehow at that point in time, it was a difficult time coming for the indigenous inhabitants of these landmass. Today, we like to call them the American Indians. They somehow were not in contact with the rest of the known world. We all know how during this period, Europe was struggling with poverty, disease, congestion. People were crowding out the cities in huge numbers. Agriculture was sparse. It was not producing enough to meet the demands of the people there. So it was a situation where diseases would appear from time to time and kill a lot of people. These diseases went to the Americas from Europe with the Portuguese and the Spanish conqueror and colonialists. As you all know, the Spanish and the Portuguese conquerors were also known as the conquistadors. And on account of the pervasiveness of these diseases, which went far into the interiors of the Americas, entire communities got perished. They did not have the necessary immunity to fight these diseases. And that's why it is said that even before the conquistadors could conquer the native population of the Americas with their superior weapons, the diseases had already conquered the land for them. This began a process of colonization of the Americas. But the story does not end here. The process of colonization in the Americas continued to thrive because, as I have already said, people in Europe were trying to escape poverty, hunger, disease, the congested living conditions in the towns and cities of Europe, and also religious persecution. All of you may be knowing about how people who did not agree with the organized religions of the continent used to be referred to as dissenters and were being put sometimes to the haystacks to be burnt alive. So that was the kind of religious persecution which happened. And it is said that many such dissenters who ventured into the Americas came to be called the Pilgrim Fathers. There is an apocryphal story about this. We all know the sacred text of Christianity is the Bible. Now, a process of reformation was just about taking shape in Europe, and there were people who did not agree to the kind of interpretations which organized church used to be making of the Bible. So they dissented and wanted to leave the faith the way they understood it. Therefore, when they were sought to be persecuted and sometimes were hounded out of the cities and villages, they formed themselves into groups to live for the Americas, where they thought they could find the true spirit of the religion in the way they understood it. So these Pilgrim Fathers went with copies of the Bible to the Americas, and during the long journey overseas, some portions of the Bible were being eaten up by termites, and it became an apocryphal story. The portions with which they had disagreements had actually been eaten up by the termites, and thus their faith in what they believed to be true Christianity, the pure Christianity, came to be vindicated. So this is how the Bible colonies in the Americas were also established. So this accounts for the growing number of people from Europe trying to go to the Americas. By the 18th century, there were huge plantations which had been set up in these areas. That means in the Americas. And these plantations were worked by the slaves who had been captured in Africa and were being brought to these plantations to work. They were growing cotton and sugar. These commodities were very much in demand in the European markets. So now the people seeking to go for better opportunities to the America from Europe found enough incentive in these plantations, and these provided them opportunities to go to the Americas. Until this time, China and India accounted for much of the world's wealth. As we have already explained earlier, the Indian Ocean trade system had enabled India to be one of the richest places on earth. The entire trade system in the Indian Ocean region actually revolved around India, which was at its center. Similarly, China, which is sometimes referred to as the Middle Kingdom, was also a quite resourceful country. And as we have already explained, through the Silk routes, some of which traversed through the land and some by the seas, Chinese articles of interest and importance, like the silk, used to flow through these trade routes, making China in the process a quite rich country. But from now on, the rising importance of the Americas tilted the balance westward. It made Europe the center of world trade. How it happened needs a little bit of explanation. Now, as we have already stated, precious metals and their mining in an aggressive way by the colonists enabled them to finance their trade with the East, particularly India and the East Indies. And when plantations were set up within India itself, these plantations helped them to finance their trade with China. All of you may be familiar with the Opium War. Opium was cultivated in India, taken to China, sold there, people got hooked to its consumption, and the money that was earned through this trade was used to finance the East India Company to pay for its imports from China. This is how, as India and China fell to Western colonialism and the vicious cycle of trade financing, the center of prosperity shifted from Asia to Europe. This happened during the 19th and this 20th centuries. We will study these things in the lesson as well. Since these are very important aspects of globalization, we will study them in parts. First, we will see what kind of changes were brought in during the 19th century, and subsequently we will also discuss how these changes were furthered during the 20th century. Because both these centuries saw very conspicuous results leading to the globalization of the world. And there are also human stories involved, as we have already discussed. Not only ideas and goods went from place to place, but along with them diseases also traveled, making people suffer immensely. Besides, subjugation of entire populace also became the order of the day during this period, particularly in the African continent, where there used to be plenty of availability of livestock and land resources. People used to live a self-sustaining life. There was no need for them to work for wage. And as the Europeans went into the Africas, they found people not willing to work for them. They devised many ways by which the African people were dispossessed of their land and livestock. Here diseases also played a very important role. Diseases traveling from Europe led to immense casualties among the livestock population in the whole of Africa. It is said that about 90% of the livestock population in Africa, particularly the cattle population, perished on account of such diseases. So now people divested of their cattle population, and also agriculture had no other option but to work for the Europeans, and they were recruited as laborers, and they were taken to work in the plantations in the Americas. So, as I said, in our next session, we shall discuss about the process of globalization during the 19th century, and thereafter we shall discuss about the process of globalization during the 20th century. In the meantime, you can look at some of the maps and pictures which have come along with the discussion in today's session. Thank you.